Hello everyone, welcome to Inconvenient Truths. I'm your host, Jennifer Zeng. In our last episode, we talked about why the CCP could be deliberately undermining China's economy to maintain its power. We talked about four aspects of China's road to intentional depression. Today, let's talk about two other aspects and what the future could be like if this is true. The fifth major event on the CCP's road to intentional depression is the control of society. In 2020, when COVID spread globally, the CCP imposed the tightest controls over society, keeping people imprisoned in their own homes. This kind of strict measure was not so much to prevent the virus from spreading. Instead, it was a social test by the CCP to see how well the public would tolerate its toughest controls. The results of the three-year test have been very satisfactory to the CCP. From an internationalized metropolis like Shanghai to the most remote small villages, the CCP has almost controlled the people to death without meeting any resistance. The CCP did not even use much or any force. A single phone call from the Residence Committee's office or just a rope across the street was enough to keep everyone at home. No one dared to defy the command. In the end, the lockdowns were suddenly lifted, not because the so-called white paper revolution, but because the tests had been enough and yield results. So in conclusion, at this point, there was no doubt that a national policy of intentional depression had reached the stage of receiving the final result. The CCP had succeeded in brainwashing the people and empty their wallets. The most difficult external factor, the foreign investment, had been driven away, and the great social suppression model had been tested. Therefore, there could be no big concerns about any meaningful resistance in the future process of de-industrialization. It is also important to note that all policies in China in the last decade have been driven from the top down, which is completely different from the beginning of the reform and opening up stage. For example, the reform of rural land contracting and management rights in 1979 and the reform of the collective construction land transfer in 2013 were both bottom up, with reform proposals put forward at the local level and then summarized by the central government for nationwide implementation after sufficient experience was accumulated. But after 2014, the entire decision-making mechanism suddenly changed. Policies were suddenly sent down from the top to the lowest level, and the local authorities were only required to follow them without asking any questions. If we understand that all of China's top-level policies in the last decade had been aimed at de-industrialization, then it is not difficult to predict what direction China's economy and society will take in 2024 and beyond. First, the CCP will close its doors and further disassociate itself from the world, and the relations with Europe, America, Japan, and South Korea will have to deteriorate further. Second, the CCP will engage in provoking more international conflicts and will stand firmly against Europe, the US, and Japan in these conflicts. For example, provoke conflicts between North and South Korea, find ways to make the situation in the Middle East deteriorate further, disrupt the political order in South Africa, and block and disrupt navigation of several major canals and straits, such as the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. The more chaotic the global economic order is, the quicker the pace of China's de-industrialization can move forward. Third, stirring up the nerves of neighboring countries and regions so that the shadow of war will always hang over China. Using war as an excuse to blockade the country is, of course, the best way. The goal of the CCP is to blockade the country, not the war itself. The war is just a pretext, so the CCP does not need to win any wars, and it does not matter if it loses. It just needs to control the propaganda and narrative inside China. The key is to keep the cloud of war around for a long time, and that is enough. With this in mind, the South China Sea territory issue is a very good excuse for ordinary Chinese people who are especially sentimental about their territory and cannot afford to let 1 inch of it go. So the CCP is very likely to use the territorial excuse to stir up trouble, to stir up national sentiments, and to divert internal attention in one go. Therefore, the territory conflicts in the South China Sea between the CCP and the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam will become more and more violent, and the level of conflict will become higher and higher, from spraying each other with water cannons to engaging in hand-to-hand combat, and then escalating to bloodshedding and some deaths, until there is a limited armed conflict. At this point, it will be about right. There is no need for a formal declaration of war or deteriorating to the point of fighting a national war. The goal will be achieved if the two sides form a formal armed confrontation between warships in the South China Sea and completely disrupt the South China Sea shipping routes and the order in maritime transportation. Of course, the best excuse would still be Taiwan. In the CCP's eyes, the conflict between the CCP and Taiwan can be defined as an internal conflict. And even if a war were to occur, the CCP believes that it could be defined as a civil war and a war of not a war of aggression against an independent country. Of course, since the goal of the CCP is to blockade China and de-industrialize it, a war with Taiwan is not an end in itself, and it would even be very problematic to actually take Taiwan. With this in mind, the CCP may gradually escalate the situation, starting with taking Taiwan's outlying islands. The first step would be to occupy Kinmen, Machu, and then take Penghu Islands and Dongsha Islands. In this way, the CCP can take de facto control of the Taiwan Strait, blocking sea transportation. This would be enough to create a permanent armed confrontation with Taiwan. To heighten tensions, the CCP might send in unmanned aircraft to bomb strategic points in Taiwan day and night. It is not necessary to actually destroy these targets, but rather to create the appearance of a constant state of war. In a state of war, all judicial and legal proceedings must cease and give way to war, and the CCP officials will have the power to decide the life and death of ordinary Chinese people with a single word. Well, how do all this sound to you? Leave us a comment to let us know what your thoughts are, and I will continue the discussion. And I will continue to discuss more aspects of this matter in the next and the final episode of this series. That's all for today. If you feel like signing up for a membership and make a donation, please visit my website at jenniferzengblog.com. jenniferzengblog.com. Otherwise, please help me spread the word by subscribing to my channel or sharing my videos. Thank you. See you next time.